Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 2 of my review of the Taverns of Time exclusive arena cards. If you didn't hear, a bunch of new arena cards are being added to Hearthstone on June 11th, but only in the arena, but they're cool new time-themed cards, and they're pretty darn awesome. I already reviewed all of the neutral cards in part 1. Now I'm going to be jumping into the class cards, of which there are 2 for each of the 9 classes. Lots of cards to get through, so I'm going to move a little bit faster than I might normally, probably much to the excitement of many viewers. That said, let's go ahead and jump into these 18 new arena exclusive cards. Up first here we have Warrior's Fate Cleaver, a 4-mana 4/2 weapon. And before we read anything else, that already makes this card good. Weapons in Arena are fantastic. We've seen in the past with something like True Silver Champion, that 4/2 line is just fine in Arena, often works really, really well. So Warrior's going to find some use out of this. Now, it also has some text here that I don't think is quite as impactful, but could occasionally have some upside, in that after it kills a minion, it destroys all copies of it. So, for instance, if you kill, who knows, just any random thing on your opponent's side of the board, if they drafted 4 of those, you would also destroy the remaining 3 in their deck. Now, that's not always a good thing necessarily. If you kill small stuff, you might take all kinds of small bad draws out of your opponent's deck. You could also theoretically destroy your own minions if you drafted the same minion as something you kill, because this does say all copies of it, not just your opponent's. But theoretically, there are some instances where, with particularly things like Infinite Murloc being added to Arena with this expansion, that you might be able to destroy all their Infinite Murlocs so they don't continue that chain. There are some new cards in particular that seem to be relevant to this effect. So definitely a slightly advantageous addition to the card. Nonetheless, it probably doesn't really matter all that much just because a 4-mana 4/2 is really good. That to me means this will be a 4-star card. Up next here, another warrior card, we have the Draconic Herald, a 6-mana 5/6. Not the best stat line necessarily for 6 mana. It's acceptable in Arena. A 5 attack minion with that much health is a pretty reasonable body, of course. But the battle cry here is where this card gets very exciting. It allows you to discover a minion, and then you take that minion, you give it +3/+3 in stats, and you put it on the top of your deck, so it becomes the very next thing that you draw. And of course, discovering a minion is good. You can pick something that fits your curve, something that fits the situation you expect to find on the board, just something really awesome, maybe a big legendary. Giving it 3/3 is fantastic. That just makes it bigger. And then you know you're going to draw it. So that consistency and predictability makes it a really nice addition to your deck, makes up for any slight negative in regards to the stat total for this minion, and frankly a 5/6 is kind of fine anyway. So all in all, I think that the very slight downside of playing this thing on curve for the potential to do something crazy next turn is really, really good, making this a nice strong card for Warrior. 4 stars. So up next here, let's move on to Warlock with the Rift Warden, a 7-mana 5/5. Battlecry reads, discard a random minion, death rattle, summon it. So, frankly, I just don't think this is going to work very well. Obviously, there are some problems with discarding things. And, of course, in this case, you do potentially get it back. But when you compare this to other death rattle cards out there that are at similar cost, similar stat lines, I mean, just take like Savannah Highmane, for instance, for Hunter, a great card. That gives you minions guaranteed consistently good. You get 2 2/2s. That's something of value. It costs a mana less. It has better base stats. And you don't risk discarding something you might want to play in the same turn, or something that's really insane that will then get silenced potentially with your Rift Warden, or might just not die for a while because your Rift Warden could get frozen or stuck on the board or have to trade in a tiny little taunt, meaning that you don't actually get to activate the Death Rattle consistently and you stole a resource from your hand. So essentially a lot of downsides here, a lot of risk bundled into the Rift Warden, and because its stats just aren't that exciting for a 7-drop, they're okay in Arena, just clearly understated for its size or cost, then it's just too much can go wrong here, and it's not a fast enough, high tempo enough play, seemingly to me, to look very good. If it was like a 7/7, might be worth it to get some potential upside off that Death Rattle, but you're paying a lot. There's a penalty for time here and tempo, so Rift Warden looks a bit weak to me. I'm going to give it 2 stars. Up next here we have Grasp the Future, a 4-mana card draw spell for Warlock. You draw 2 cards, and then they get discounted by 2 mana each. So in some ways you could say this is kind of a free card draw because you're paying 4, but you're getting 4 in discounts. Of course, in reality, that doesn't always line up, at least in the same turn, because you might draw expensive things that you can't play in the same turn. If you drew 2 mana cards in every case, then sure, you could play them instantly, and it would be a nice sort of refill. And obviously, that's good. It's like way better than something like Farsight, for instance. For Shaman, same sort of effect, but double the power, essentially. And cost discounts can be fantastic because they allow you to play things much, much faster in a future turn. It's good in the late game. The real issue with Grasp of the Future for me is that Warlock isn't necessarily a class that's looking for a lot of card draw because, of course, they have their hero power. And they're often able to weave in a hero power now and then so that their hand stays full. So I don't know that the slight tempo sacrifice you make with Grasp of the Future, spending mana now in order to get mana discounted later, is going to be very sensible for a class like Warlock just because the cycle itself doesn't have that much raw value. It's certainly going to be fine. I'm not saying it's a bad card. There are other classes, though, I think that could utilize this in incredible ways. Warlock probably not as much. So a solid card, 3 stars in my mind. It's just not going to blow anybody out of the water, but will certainly be a reasonable card to pick in Arena and playable and non-punishing, so just fine. Up next here we have Shaman's Stasis Elemental, a 4-mana 3/5, and I love this battle cry. Freeze a minion until this leaves the battlefield. So we have technically a permanent freeze if you can keep your Stasis Elemental alive. And first off, I think even if it was just a regular freeze, this card would be okay. 4-mana 3/5 is an okay stat line, and freeze in Arena can be very, very powerful, stalling out your opponent's big stuff, buying you time, allowing you to set up boards, find lethal, etc. So I like it just as is, as a freeze effect for a single turn, if it were normally just a freeze. But that added wording there where if it lasts for multiple turns because you're able to protect your Stasis Elemental, that becomes insane. And sometimes in Arena, it's just not that hard to keep stuff alive. Just a couple small taunts can be enough of an interruption that a minion can linger around. Of course, Shaman already has the taunt totem in their hero power as well. That could get in the way. If you're freezing things, it's kind of likely that your opponent might not be able to trade back immediately as well. So this card has a built-in protection aspect, and that it can freeze the most relevant thing on board. So it seems kind of nuts, honestly, because there's a good chance you're going to lock down a minion for a really, really long time. At least 2 or 3 turns, and that is just a huge advantage. And this card helps you protect and actually gain that advantage by itself. So it seems like the swing potential here is absolutely crazy. At the very least, if your opponent does have some way to answer it, if they have a fireball in hand, they're probably going to have to make a play they don't really want to make by prioritizing some removal on a pretty non-threatening 4-drop. So there's even some upside there when it dies. You cause a lot of friction and potentially lead them into some bad plays. So I absolutely adore Stasis Elemental. I think this is an easy 5-star card. It's going to be fantastic. Up next here we have the Master of Realities. I think this is another really strong card for Shaman. 6-mana 5/7 is an okay stat line. On top of that, here we have a just nutty effect that is essentially an evolve after you summon a minion, transform it into a random minion that costs 2 more. And note that says summon, not play. So anything being pulled into play, including totems, are actually going to instantly be transformed into higher cost stuff. And it's not just a single evolve, it's actually 2 times because it's going to get 2 additional mana points added on. So your totems turn into 3-drops, which are often really good minions and a giant stat upgrade. And given that this is only 6 mana, you can play multiple things in a single turn alongside it to really accelerate the value of those cheap minions in the late game into bigger stuff. And if this thing, of course, lingers on board for a while, it becomes absolutely crazy. Now, obviously, with any sort of evolve, there's some RNG, there's potential downside, but in Arena, that's mitigated even more than in Constructed, because not all of your minions are necessarily perfect or awesome anyway. You might have some bad stuff, so evolving into bad things isn't necessarily as big of a downside as it might be in Constructed, where you're trading good stuff into bad stuff. You're trading often mediocre things into mediocre things, but mediocre things that are often, too bigger in size, so it usually is going to work out in your favor. And of course, you can always mitigate that risk too if you're ahead on board or you don't want to take any crazy risks. Nonetheless, Master of Realities just looks awesome. There's a lot of value bundled into this thing. Stats are king in Arena often, and this thing helps you find more of them without sacrificing much of stats itself because it has a reasonable stat line for its cost. So I think this card's going to be awesome for Shaman, a 5-star card. Up next here we have Rogue's Thief of Futures, a 4-mana 4/3. Battlecry reads, add a copy of the top card of your opponent's deck to your hand. And this is a cool little information gathering resource. Not only does it generate you a card, which is cool, but it tells you what your opponent might have access to in the future. And I don't think you can underestimate the importance of that, because knowing what's in your opponent's hand really helps you make smart, sound decisions. If you know, for instance, they have a Flame Strike, you're going to change how you play. You're also going to get a Flame Strike, which is pretty awesome. Now, it won't always lend to really advantageous informational resources, because it might just be some random junky minion, and in that case you don't get much value out of it either. So it's not always going to turn out great. Other times it's going to be just fantastic. But drawing a card, or in this case generating a card specifically, can help you keep a full hand of resources arena moving into the mid to late game, which is nice. The 4/3 stat line here, not awesome, a little bit susceptible for 4 mana. You would hope for like a 4/4, 4/5, of course, to really make this thing sing. But as it stands, I think it still has some value, some cool uses. So a reasonable choice in Arena, a 3-star card. Up next here for Rogue is Deja Vu, a 1-mana spell that says discover a copy of a spell you played this game. And essentially this means it's kind of a 1-mana cycle card. It turns itself into another card. That's fine. That can have some utility, certainly in Hearthstone. The problem for Deja Vu with me is that I just don't think it's often going to lend itself into anything very powerful, because Rogue, although they have some good spells and some cheap tempo spells, they just don't have any like really insane, awesome results. There's no Flame Strikes or Ultimate Infestations in the Rogue pool, unless of course you copy one from your opponent, which is a possibility. It doesn't specify necessarily a Rogue card, I guess, although Discover does often emphasize class cards, so who knows exactly how that operation will interact. But regardless, even if you did burgle something from your opponent and put it in the pool for Deja Vu, that's so unlikely and inconsistent that it doesn't really make this card any better. Beyond that, things like maybe, Assassinate are pretty good to get off of Deja Vu, but, there's a lot of backstabs and eviscerates that just aren't that exciting. They're okay, but it's not necessarily something super game-changing. And then you're paying 3 mana essentially for an eviscerate, which isn't some crazy awesome play. Beyond that, this is a dead card sometimes, because you don't always play spells early in arena runs. You can't play this on turn 1, for instance. It just whiffs. So there's, you got to wait a while to make this 1 mana card worthwhile. That to me makes it just worse than something like Hallucination, for instance, which can always cycle into something new. Clearly, you can control your Deja Vu a little bit if you're careful. There's some upside there. So at the end of the day, yeah, it can do some things occasionally, but I think other times it's just going to fail and fall really short, and your deck is not going to support it. So Deja Vu seems like a very niche pick that would only be good at the very end of a draft, after you've got a lot of supporting pieces you're going to want to Deja Vu into. So the risk there basically means I think this is a 2-star card. Up next here, we have a priest card, Ripple in Time, another 1-mana spell. This one allows you to discover a minion, and if you play it right away this turn, it gains Echo. And that's a pretty crazy kind of thing. There's a lot of nutty stuff that can happen there. Now, obviously, 4 mana becomes the interesting breakpoint for a card like Ripple in Time, because 4 mana, you could echo it twice. If you grabbed a 5 mana card, the echo wouldn't matter, because you'd only have, at most, 9 mana remaining. You couldn't play it twice. So you have to think about really interesting 4 mana cards that you could potentially discover off this, and what they could do. And for instance, 3 mana cards get even better, because then you can play them 3 times. 2 mana cards are pretty cool because you can play them 4 times. Now, if there's any kind of crazy 1 mana card, you could theoretically play it 9 times, although you can't usually fit 9 minions onto the board, so that might be rather difficult. But just things like Stonehill Defender, for instance, you could discover Stonehill Defender and play 3 of them in a single turn, and that would just be absolutely bonkers. So there are some high roll results here. Now, the problem with Discover is that often it's going to be priest cards, and not all priest cards lend themselves perfectly to being echoed. It's fine. You can generate a big, crazy wide board off of 1 card, even with just like Radiant Elementals. That's pretty cool. That's a good result. but nothing like game breaking, I don't think, at least nothing that comes to mind. And then occasionally, you know, sometimes you might just want like an obsidian statue off this, and you don't care if it gets echo, you're just happy to take that 9-mana obsidian statue to fill out your turn. So a lot of great results here, and you know, worst case scenario, you just play like 3 average 3-drops onto the board, which sometimes in Arena is just enough. Echo can be pretty powerful at helping you reload a board or cement a board lead. So I like Ripple in Time a lot. I don't think it's necessarily a game-winning 5-star card, but I do think really solid addition, 4-star card. It's going to help in a lot of different kinds of decks, and probably is playable in almost any sort of Arena deck just because of the flexibility it offers. So 4 stars, strong card. So moving on to the next priest card here, we have Reminisce, another spell at 2 mana. This time it says add 2 random cards that your opponent played this game to your hand. So in some ways, this is a bit of a cheaper thought steal. It's, you know, borrowing stuff from your opponent. The restriction being, though, that it has to be cards your opponent played previously. And that, to me, is kind of where this card starts to fall apart because, for instance, on turn 2, this isn't something you can just play because it's very unlikely your opponent has played anything. So you can't just use this as a curve filler, which you do sometimes with cards like Thought Still. When you just don't have anything else to do on turn 3, you just slam Thought Still, you're generating resources. That doesn't work for Reminisce. This only works later. And if you play it in the mid-game, there's a pretty good chance you're only going to be adding junky, low-cost minions to your hand because your opponent hasn't had time to play anything good or great. And basically, even if you play it on turn 10, for instance, you know, your opponent has mostly played things that are lower cost up to that point. So the likelihood of finding something really powerful off of Reminisce is very, very low from the beginning, and it only slightly increases throughout the course of the game. Even 20 turns into the game might only be, you know, a third of the things that you could potentially get are going to be very powerful, big, scary minions or removal spells or anything else. So often you're going to get junk. Unlike Thoughtsteal, which can just kind of get you anything, this is often going to get you pretty weak resources. So I don't really like Reminisce. It's basically going to turn itself into like a plated beetle and a random 4-drop occasionally. And that's okay in Arena, but it's just not good. It's not great. There are better tools, and I just don't know how many cards Reminisce is going to beat when you're selecting it in a draft. Just doesn't seem that strong to me, so I actually think this is only a 2-star card. Moving on next here to Paladin, we have the Bronze Broodmother, a 5-mana 5/5 that reads, when you draw this, summon a 1/1 Wee Whelp. And yeah, this is a fine card. It's pretty solid. It's, you know, 5/5 for 5 is okay. Sometimes that'll be just dandy to play onto the board. And of course, that free 1/1 may not seem like much, but as we've seen with patches in the past, sometimes a free 1/1 can really snowball to a pretty big advantage. So don't underestimate the value. Now, the unpredictability of that 1/1 is a problem. It's going to be far more impactful in the early game than it will be on turn 12, for instance. Who cares about a 1/1 on turn 12? Probably won't add up to much. But, you know, that occasional slight advantage in Arena can really snowball to some big stuff. Just setting up that trade, you can kill that 7/7 instead of leaving it at 7/1. Like, that could be huge in the mid game. So 1/1 in free stats is totally fine, particularly because there's not really much downside to Bronze Broodmother. Now, that said, it does have to beat other cards when you pick it. So it depends on the kind of bucket it fits into, whether this is going to be something that you end up drafting. But nonetheless, I think it's a completely reasonable tool and asset in Arena. It's a 3-star card. Up next here, we have the Blessing of Aeons for Paladin. 1-mana buff spell. It says, give a minion at the end of your turn, gain +1/+1. And that's not quite a Gruul effect. It's a Gruul style effect, but Gruul actually grows at the end of every turn, both yours and your opponent's. This would specifically only be at the end of your turn. And, you know, most of the time that's not going to be great necessarily, because it's usually going to result in a +1/+1 because your opponent will find some way to deal with it. But I do think it's pretty interesting if you got this out early enough. If you played like a 1-drop and coined Blessing of Aeons, that might lead to some really big snowball-style advantages where your opponent couldn't answer it and you got a value trade, and then they couldn't answer it and you got a value trade. It's basically just always staying a little bit farther ahead. Now, with the way, you know, increasing mana costs in Arena work and the way with minions typically getting bigger and bigger, your opponent would eventually play minions that would allow them to trade back into the Blessing of Aeon, because attack values often increase by more than +1/+1, and of course it's stacking. If it value trades and then value trades, it's eventually going to run out of health. So they would catch up eventually. The question is, have you mounted enough of an advantage with the leftover mana you have every turn that you just win the game anyway? In the right kind of aggressive deck, it could definitely work. You could do that. The problem, of course, is if you don't get this on turn 1, if you draw this on turn 10, it's just going to be a totally dead card, because by the time that mid-game to late-game board battle has started to enact itself, that +1/+1 is just going to evaporate instantly, and this card didn't go anywhere as far as depth or long-term value is concerned. So only in the right kind of hyper-aggressive Paladin deck do I think this would be good. And in those scenarios, I wouldn't be surprised if it actually worked out okay. The fact that it just keeps coming and coming and coming, I can see a total nightmare. Now, again, it's just +1/+1 per turn, so it's never going to go absolutely nuts like some other buffs with like Questing Adventurer or the Undertaker of old. Stuff like that's never going to happen. But still a solid tool on occasion, so I think I'm going to give this thing 3 stars. So up next here, we're moving on to Mage. This is Consider the Past, a 4-mana spell. It reads, add 3 random spells from the past to your hand. Now, from the past, we've seen from Toki, Time Tinker, and Constructed Now means from wild format. This does not mean cards played previously. I'd seen some people saying that in other reviews. They were wrong. They didn't think about that very much. So this is wild format spells, and since these are random spells, we have to presume they're not mage spells. They could be from any given class. So this is sort of like Kabbalist's Tome with a discount, but with way more variability and, of course, all kinds of crazy surprises because it's only wild format spells. And unfortunately, I think that's sort of the downfall of this card. There's just a lot of weird synergy-based spells and really clunky stuff in wild format, and really just the unpredictability is a huge problem. It is a great resource generator. I mean, 3 cards for 4 mana is a fantastic return. Kabbalist's Tome's a playable card, right, for 5 mana, so you can see why this one's even better. That doesn't necessarily translate all that well into Arena, though, because you're sacrificing a lot of tempo in order to generate resources, which can often backfire in Arena. Like, this is not the kind of thing you want to be doing on turn 4 typically, although it would probably be fine later in the game because it saves you 6 remaining mana to still address the board and make plays. The problem is, what do you get that's good? How often do you get anything can happen and you're just like, oh god, I can't use a 10-mana spell? And there are just a million other examples of wild format spells that just aren't that good. Now, granted, there are some good ones too. Like, yeah, there's Firelands Portal still. That'd be amazing. But your likelihood of finding that, is 1 out of 100 or whatever it is, 1 out of 50 or something. So it's just so inconsistent. I don't think this is going to work very well. It's going to be super fun, and people are going to draft it and try to make it work, and I can't wait to see those highlights. But ultimately, I do actually think this is only a 2-star card. Up next here for Mage, we have the Cavern Dreamer, a 2-mana 1/3 that reads, at the end of your turn, add a random spell that costs 2 or less to your hand. And this is a cool little card. I kind of like this one because, like I said before, sometimes you can't just tuck away cards into a turn or into a board state where they're likely to survive for a few turns. They're just sort of incidental. This is a non-threatening dude. Your opponent might have to focus on other things to maintain a board advantage. So this guy just kind of chugs along and generates you 2 or 3 free resources for only 2 mana, and that's a great result. And frankly, even if he just cycles himself into one other spell and it's kind of looking like a free 1/3 that contests the board, kills a, Paladin hero power, it does something. It contributes at least a little bit. So I think this card's just all upside. There's really not much risk in running this thing. Potentially snowballs into some crazy, I've said snowball a lot, but it's a good word. Potentially turns into just lots of value. You get 3 or 4 frostbolts or whatever, backstabs or random, crazy 2-mana spells all over the case. All over the place that could be great. Some are going to be bad, but they're kind of free in some ways. 1/3 is not terrible for 2 mana. You'd prefer 2/3, but nonetheless, it's okay. So it's just upside. I think it's a totally fine card. Not going to win you games necessarily on its own, but a 4-star card that's going to be fun to run and have a lot of value in specific games. Other games it'll fail, won't do much, but occasionally it's going to really help you cement a lead and build a lot of resources. So that's good to have in Arena. Up next here, we have the Infinite Wolf for Hunter. And man, this one's hard to figure out. It's 4 mana, 5/5 with Rush. That is awesome right off the bat. Let's just talk about that. That right there is amazing. But there's kind of a downside / upside here. It reads, after this attacks, shuffle it into your deck and give future Infinite Wolves +2/+2. So if it attacks and survives, you don't get to keep it on board. It doesn't linger around as like a 5/2 or whatever. It goes back into your deck, and presumably it becomes a 7/7, not a 7/4. I don't think it would retain the damage that it took, although that is a little bit iffy because it does say shuffle it into your deck, not like a duplicate or copy of Infinite Wolf. So that kind of remains to be seen, but it actually doesn't matter much because the minion never stays on board. After it attacks, every time it goes back into the deck. So, well, I guess theoretically if it dies, it does not shuffle. My understanding of the reading here would be that if it kills itself on the trade, that it wouldn't be shuffled because it's no longer around to be shuffled. I think the minion would have to survive. But I'm assuming most of the time you're going to use this as a value trade sort of thing, which won't be hard because on turn 4 at 5 health, it should usually value trade. Moving forward, as a 7/7, it would usually value trade, etc., etc. So 9/9, you get it. You get the idea. So it's always going to be value trading in my mind. And what that means is you kind of get this great 4 mana single target removal spell constantly being added back into your deck. The issue is that it never becomes a persistent on-board threat. Now, technically, I guess if you did eventually get it up to like, 13/13, you could just play it onto the board for 4 mana and not attack immediately into a minion, but just save it as a 13/13 and then eventually use it to attack face for a killing blow. So it's not only this recycling and repeating removal spell, but it also becomes kind of a late game bomb giant minion that might be, a finisher, and you save it to, end the game essentially as Hunter because you've chipped away your opponent's health, of course, throughout the course of the game. So in some ways, that's pretty darn amazing, I have to say. Now, my only concern for a card like this is if you get into some of those mid to late game board states where your opponent has played, multiple 3 or 4 drops, they're getting a slightly wider board, they have, 3 or 4 attack minions out there, and you draw your Infinite Wolf as an 11/11, and it basically runs into like a 3/3, and then it goes away. And your opponent still has 3 other minions on board. In other words, single target removal can sometimes fail pretty hard in Arena. Now, you might say, well, I'll have other cards on board because I have 6 remaining mana, whatever. I'll be able to address those other things with my other cards, which might be the case in some decks. But Hunter typically has trouble keeping cards coming. They run out of resources, and they need to either end the game or swing super hard, and I don't know that Infinite Wolf is always going to be able to do that. There's going to be a lot of board states where this thing just falls flat, and it runs into a Stonehill Defender as, a 17/17 or whatever. So that's not an exciting play anymore. That said, I do still think the upsides here and the potential just to recycle this thing over and over again probably far outweigh those negative board states that it's going to have problems with. So I do think this is a 4-star card and probably very close to a 5-star card, but just because it's not going to be perfect in every scenario and it's not necessarily a great proactive tool, then I guess I'm docking it just a little bit as far as points are concerned. So only 4 stars, but probably very close to 5 stars. And then speaking of 5-star cards here, we have Chrono Shot for Hunter, a 3-mana sap, essentially, that returns an enemy minion to your opponent's hand, but it's also a little bit freezing trap because it also makes that minion cost 2 additional mana. And sap is already a fantastic card in Arena. It's just a super high tempo removal spell, essentially, that forces your opponent to replay a minion and spend tons of mana once again, and that can provide all kinds of swing opportunities. Chrono Shot does the exact same thing, really cheap, hyper-efficient removal that punishes your opponent even more when it comes to tempo because they have to spend an additional 2 mana. And in some cases, they might not even be able to do that if you sap, a 9, or Chrono Shot in this case, a 9-mana minion. So there's little debate. This card's going to be fantastic just because Sap is great already. We know Chrono Shot is going to work incredibly well as a single target removal spell as well. So I think this thing is easy, 5 stars, awesome card. Up next here for Druid, we have the Harbinger of Catastrophe, a 6-mana 6/7 that reads, at the start of your turn, summon the highest cost minion from each player's deck. And man, so it's a Boulder Fist Ogre at its base. That's fine. That's good sometimes. That works. But there's some shenanigans here because clearly this could backfire. You're going to summon some really big stuff into play probably. And your opponent could theoretically have bigger stuff than you. And you won't really know what they're going to have. So there's a lot of risk bundled into the Harbinger. But if you build your deck in the right way, you could also potentially get a huge advantage. You could summon like an Ironbark Protector, and your opponent might just summon like a Chillwind Yeti or something. You never really know if they build a really aggressive deck. Usually everybody's going to have some 6 or 7 drops thrown around in there. But still, if you build your deck in the right way, you could theoretically gain a pretty big advantage. Not to mention, because this happens at the start of your turn, you are going to have the initiative to react to what happens. So if you have some sort of single target removal spell, you might be able to kill their big thing while your big thing stays alive, or maybe just your Harbinger of Catastrophe itself will trade into their big thing, and you're left with the other big thing. And potentially this continues over multiple turns. This doesn't just happen once. If your Harbinger stays alive, you could keep summoning bigger and bigger things. So, I mean, yeah, there is some upside here in the right kind of deck. The problem is building that deck, drafting your Harbinger at the right stage of the arena draft to make that work. If you draft it early, you may not get the tools you need. If you draft it late, you might not have got the removal you needed. There's all kinds of problems lining this thing up. Nonetheless, I think there's going to be a deck here and there that can use this successfully, so I am still going to give this 3 stars despite some of the risk and the downsides. I do think because of its stat line being reasonable and Druid having lots and lots of big stuff as an option, that this thing could actually be playable. And then finally, one last card here. This is Flash Forward, a 3-mana spell that reads, each player gains 2 mana crystals and draws 2 cards. So the way this works is those mana crystals, based on this wording, would be active mana crystals, much like Nourish when you gain the mana crystals. So you'd spend 3 on this, but you'd get an instant 2 mana refund. So this would really only cost you 1 mana to cast in a given turn, and you draw 2 cards right away. And that's a pretty cool instant infusion of card draw for 1 mana, essentially. Also, the ramp could be very beneficial if you have a high-cost deck you're trying to accelerate into really big minions to gain yourself an advantage. The downside, of course, is that it's symmetrical. You're also giving your opponent mana and cards as well, and they're not even paying the 1 penalty price, essentially, for Flash Forward either, or the 1 mana penalty. They're getting to use the mana right away. But the upside is that you see the cards you get first, and you can play the cards you get first as well. So you get to benefit before your opponent does, which sometimes can be really nice. If you draw this on an empty hand, you desperately need those 2 cards. It doesn't matter if you're giving your opponent's cards because you're still gaining some sort of advantage. So it's kind of cool in some ways, and if you build your deck again in the right way with big stuff and you don't think your opponent's going to be able to benefit as well from being at a higher mana cost as you are, like you're going to have more big things and bigger bombs and higher mana totals are going to be better for you than them, then sure, Flash Forward could be advantageous. Clearly still a lot of downside in this card. Could backfire in some major ways. If your opponent has the perfect minion to play at any given mana cost, or you push them into AoE a little too soon, there's a lot of problems potentially with Flash Forward, but the slightly asymmetrical nature of the symmetrical effect does tend to benefit you a little bit more, I think. So I would say a playable card at 3 stars, if not a particularly exciting or awesome one. And there you go. That's it for my Taverns of Time exclusive arena card review part 2. 18 new cards, a lot of strong ones, a lot of playable ones, and frankly, very few bad cards, I would say. I didn't give anything 1 star. I think maybe just a couple 2 stars and 3 stars. So pretty neat set of stuff, and definitely going to shake up the arena meta in some major ways. I am excited to try all these cards out. They actually hit what for me is tomorrow on June 11th, so keep an eye out on Taverns of Time. I will certainly be playing some myself on stream and probably uploading some videos, so stay tuned for that stuff. But until then, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, game on.